Hello, good morning. Hi everyone, thank you for joining us this morning. We can't see you, but we know that there are about 100 people out there in the virtual space, and hopefully my video will start now. Oh yes, there you go. So my name is Elham Shakarifar. I'm a London-based producer. I've been producing documentaries for about 10 years, and I'm really happy to be hosting this event, focusing on feature documentary with a brilliant panel of funders who I'll introduce now. If you can give a little wave so that people know who you are, although it's also written. Adrian Kawali Lathan is creative director of Bertha Foundation, whose remit is to fight for a more just world. Bertha supports activists, storytellers, and lawyers who are working to bring about social and economic justice and human rights for all. Charlotte Cook is co-creator and executive producer of Field of Vision, which is a filmmaker-driven documentary unit that commissions and creates original short-form non-fiction films about developing and ongoing stories around the globe. They produce cinematic work that tells stories of our world from new perspectives. Khalil Ben-Kiran is head of grants at the Doha Film Institute, an independent, not-for-profit cultural organization established in 2010 to support the growth of the local film community. It's Qatar's first international organization dedicated to film financing, production, education, and film festivals. Jess Search is Chief Executive of Doc Society, a non-profit founded in 2005, committed to enabling great documentary films and connecting them to audiences globally. DocFest's driving principle is that great documentaries enrich the lives of individuals. They have a unique ability to engage and connect people, transform communities, and improve societies. And Chi-Wei Yang is a senior program officer for Just Films at the Ford Foundation. The Ford Foundation seeks to reduce inequality in all its forms, and artist-driven documentary and emerging media projects are crucial to this effort. As part of the Creativity and Free Expression program, Just Films funds social justice storytelling and 21st century arts infrastructures that support it. So thank you for joining us this morning, particularly Chi-Wei and Adrian, for whom it's very early in the morning. For those watching, there's more information about how to apply to each of these funds and foundations in the chat box. And it will be in the video description for those of you watching in the virtual future. In preparation for today's panel, I've sourced questions from groups such as the Documentary Producers UK group, the Brown Girls Doc Mafia. We've shared information about this panel on DocFest social media. And so I was really keen to ensure that the conversation was representative of a wider community's concerns. And so although I'm hosting, I feel that I'm speaking on behalf of many people. And actually I am, many of the words that I'll be saying are actually from things that people have directly emailed me or written to me. So I feel the weight of that responsibility and need to share that. There's also a Q&A function, so if you have any questions, you can drop them into the Q&A box. I'll be monitoring that, but we also have only 75 minutes, I think, and we'll try to not go too much over. So we'll try and answer as many as we can. Just to reiterate for everyone that the panel is being recorded and will be available later on YouTube with closed captions. So I'm very keen for this discussion to be a space to imagine a better documentary landscape, and speaking to the notion that the film industry as a whole is an ecosystem. I believe independent documentary is an endangered species in a sense, or at very least a rare bird. And I think that we have the power to save it and to think about the best possible forms it can exist in. And I think an important starting point is to acknowledge something that Sonia Childress and Natalie Bullock-Brown articulated very powerfully in an article for IDA a couple of weeks ago, which is the acknowledgement of the ground we're standing on in the documentary space, a practice that emerged from a colonial and therefore unequal power dynamic of representation and entertainment. They write, "It is precisely the inequity of the unchallenged filmmaker bias and motives of the chasm between the subject and audience, of film as a tool of racialized colonial power and empire that became embedded in documentary form more than 100 years ago and continues to haunt our contemporary industry. And so I'd like to start here by speaking about power and hierarchy and how you relate to this statement. So on many recent and excellent panels, from those hosted by Firelight to Doc NYC to DocFest, the discussion turns to the fact that filmmakers are the ones speaking about specific actions they're taking in seeking equity through, and the burden feels like it's often placed on those individuals, and often unsalaried individuals. So I'm keen to hear how you all as decision makers within the organizations that you represent acknowledge that power dynamic and acknowledge the power that you hold in enacting and creating a landscape for structural change, and what actions you're taking in this current context. So it's an open question. I thought perhaps, Chi-Wei, you might have some thoughts as a documentary and social justice funder. There's been a lot of discussion around agency and accountability. How are you at Ford Foundation working to level that playing field?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. It's great to be here. Hi, everybody. There's a lot of different, I think, ways to address this question. Maybe one way just to begin is thinking about the different types of infrastructures that this ecosystem needs. You know, there's real asymmetries in terms of how power is negotiated. And certainly when one is negotiating or advocating on behalf of filmmakers, and when filmmakers are forced to advocate to large corporations, there's a real asymmetry there, you know, and I think it does point to gaps in the infrastructure. And you know, one thing that Ford, alongside supporting filmmakers and film service organizations, is really feels very strong about, is supporting criticism and documentary reporting, because this is a function that is an accountability function at its core. You know, whether it's an accountability toward the aesthetics, the ethics, the power, or the business practices. And this is an area where there is just such undeveloped potential in the documentary sphere, right? And so, you know, we recently began a program called Critical Minded, which supports critics of color in the United States, and we're currently supporting research that looks more deeply into the function and the possibilities of a stronger documentary reporting and journalism sector as well. And I think ultimately that's, you know, we need more types of infrastructure like this, which do that accountability work. You know, and I think that, you know, whether it is about the critics who are thinking more deeply and engaging on questions of power and ethics and the connection between those two things, you know, and really offering that as a counterpoint to a lot of the criticism that is mainly content focused and really does not have teeth in a lot of ways to ultimately the decision making that filmmakers need to have, or if it's about economic reporters who are thinking about the business practices that a Netflix or someone else is doing, or the question of rights, etc. You know, these are ones that need, you know, I think about after the 2008 crash, you know, a lot of economics reporters simply said, we missed the ball. We were not paying attention to the right thing. We were not equipped to report on what was happening, nor were we looking at the right thing. You know, there's a real reckoning there and a learning opportunity for folks who are writing there. And I think that equally so, you know, as documentary has become such an enormous commercial sector, there needs to be an attendant sort of shift in how it's being looked at as well. And so that's one area that we're thinking a lot about that addresses part of this question.
That's really interesting work, actually. And I mean, I'd love to see also your focus is so often on the US. And I'm curious to know how, whether you see that work expanding into other spaces. You don't necessarily need to answer that, but I think there's a connectedness to, you know, European territories, the UK, for example, and a lack of accountability in these spaces that would really benefit from that kind of work and funding as well to enable those infrastructures.
Yeah, and maybe
Sorry, go ahead.
Maybe I'll just say one more thing. Yeah, certainly. I think that we hope to create models that can be replicated in other places. And it's, as a funder, it's my hope that if we can create an environment where it's, if you're an arts funder or a film funder, you should be funding criticism alongside that, because it actually really enhances the stuff that you support. It creates environment around it to create it to be stronger, right? And so it really is incumbent upon funders to fund this kind of work, and that is regardless of the geography and language.
Definitely. Adrian, I wondered whether I could come to you next. All of you very early birds, I'm asking you first. So you've been in post at Bertha for 6 months, so this is the landscape that you're entering into. And we had a lovely conversation last week about, I suppose, the plurality of time, and how, which is very much an activist notion, right? That in the present, we're laying the groundwork for a better imagined future. So I wondered whether you can speak to that and your plans with the film side of Bertha Foundation.
Certainly, thank you very much. Yeah, it's great to be here. I, of course, am very new to my role, as you mentioned. I started in January of this year, and then the pandemic hit in March. And so as I was sort of laying the groundwork and just doing stakeholder analysis, trying to understand who Bertha was as an organization, who our beneficiaries are, who our partners and grantees were, the coronavirus pandemic hit. And that, to me, ended up being an opportunity. I try and see the silver lining in everything. But it really did expose, as you all know, the global vulnerabilities and the intersectional disparities and inequities and injustices. And as, well, actually, I should speak to this first. Bertha really works at the intersection of activists, storytellers, and lawyers. And we really support them in their work to bring about social and economic justice. And so in terms of our theory of change, seeing the way that the pandemic was affecting so many vulnerabilities on an intersectional level, it gave me an opportunity to think of our new storytelling strategy as a double down on our creed, which is social justice, towards social justice without compromise. And this idea of doubling down on that, on this idea of radical inclusion for underrepresented people, and producers and etc. and storytellers as a whole within my vision for what Bertha storytelling would be moving forward. And in terms of that strategy, we talked about the timeline. I really looked at the work that Bertha had done really around documentary features and investigative journalism. We do support a lot of grantees who are working in participatory video as well. And when I looked at those in sort of a timeline that looked at the past and reconciling the traumas of the past in terms of the present and the truth, which is so important right now in this world of fake news. But then I looked at the future as well. And I looked at the history of our grantees and said, well, how much have we've been focusing a lot on nonfiction, which is so important, but how much are we also looking into the future? How are we supporting storytellers who are creating a future to live into? And how do I go about that process of making that bridge to support even, well, we were talking about, Elham and I, about hope-based narratives, because it's one thing to live so powerfully in the present and reconcile the past, but then to build hope for a future to live into. That's something that in this new strategy that literally I have them developing and rolling out as we speak. I'm really looking to find avenues through multiple medias, to really speak to that. And so, and I'm sure you're going to come to this later, but it means that, you know, when we look at documentary and you look at decolonizing the space around filmmaking and film production, how do we support that in a really tangible way to put that power into the hands of emerging filmmakers with whatever technology they have in their hands, and with whatever new tools of distribution can be created to really make the impact while supporting them financially, because it's that balance, right? And I'm sure you'll speak to that as well. But that's just a little, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, it does speak to something that I really wanted to address, or even just state within this space, which is, I mean, in my experience over the last decade in festivals and industry spaces, I think these spaces do replicate hierarchies, and that becomes disempowering for people within those spaces. And so pitching panels, meetings will place decision makers such as yourselves in a stronger position than they do filmmakers. And the simplest indication of that will be that decision makers are invited guests, whereas filmmakers have to pay for a pass as well as their travel accommodation and all of these things. And so it does make the most marginalized people in these spaces much more vulnerable by design. And that's before you even start to address what it is that people who often sit within a more marginalized space want to address through their work. And I feel that duty of care around how to engage with this hierarchical process is one of the key problems we need to address. And that duty of care falls onto a filmmaking team that's already more vulnerable, if that makes sense. Yeah, I think so. As I've said to all of you, the question of care when centering creativity is really central to what I wanted to address in this space. And maybe it would be nice to hear from, I mean, Khalil, obviously the Doha Film Institute took some time to redesign how you worked with filmmakers and devised Kumra.
Hello.
I wonder whether you could speak to that space as a space of centering creativity and what you've learned from it.
Sure. Hello, everyone. First of all, from what I've heard so far, what I want to say is that because we're open to the whole world, basically we support first and second time filmmakers from around the world, and the fund is open to non-MENA, so non-North Africans and Middle Eastern filmmakers, so the rest of the world, as we call it, for post-production, should it be their first or second feature. As far as documentaries, I think what we're looking for is we're inviting everyone that has a story that we feel is worth telling, we will consider. And I think what we're looking for is mostly creative documentary. And we understand that as soon as you touch on certain topics, formally, you may be more within the center, you don't have time, the conditions of the subject and maybe the place where you're shooting does not allow creativity, or at least formally, to push boundaries. So you may not be into creative documentary, but that doesn't mean we will not consider the film. And especially when you're open to the whole world, you have places where documentary tradition is not as developed as it would be in the US or in other countries that we know of. So we basically adapt to the region of the filmmaker, and that's our starting point. So as far as subjects, I mean, as we support also Arab filmmakers in development and production, in the Arab world, as in many other places around the world, governments are not able to maybe do their job, and filmmakers are automatically engaged to bring out everything that is not being said or that is taboo. And we do want to honor those filmmakers. So we try to support them, and through the Institute, we have various ways of also supporting these filmmakers. And the first one is what you've mentioned, is Kumra. Kumra is basically an industry event that we created, I believe, in 2015. But how it came about is, as we had started the fund in 2011, within few years, we had seen and supported very strong projects on paper. And once those films were completed 2-3 years later, we started realizing that what was excellent on paper became very good or good on film. And we started asking questions, okay, what went wrong along the way? And automatically within the Institute, we said, should we give more money to the projects? And very fast, we realized that it was not an issue of money. It was an issue of being well surrounded and having the people that will give you the support needed for every single stage of the filmmaking process. And especially with documentary, we see a lot of filmmakers having their own camera and suddenly generating 300, 400, 500 hours of footage for an issue or subject matter that they've been shooting for like 2-3 years because it's over time. But at the same time, the camera is on all the time, and the more they shoot, the more they have, but the more confused as a result they can be. And these are also filmmakers that work on their own. So basically, creating Kumara was, okay, a way for us to maybe take those projects that we had already supported, because only projects supported by the grants program are eligible to Kumara. Then we take these projects. Basically, by September, we sent some 60 questionnaires to filmmakers to find out exactly where they're at, what are their needs. And upon those information, we select some 12 projects in development and 12 in post-production, and we link them to the people they really need. So we have this event that is very intimate. We have only 45 people for 3 days. They leave, then we have another 45 people come, and the filmmakers are the only ones that stay for a period of 6 days. And they meet along the way mentors that will help them with the development of their film or their documentary in this case, or editors that will be here to help them edit down and get to the core of their intention, which actually shifts along the way. And then we have funds, we have also festival programmers and distributors, sales. So basically we create an ecosystem for these filmmakers to optimize their chances to maybe stay on track and not derail, because the road is long. And these are, for the most part, I can say that many of these filmmakers are not makers. They haven't really gone to school to study documentary film making, but they're engaged people. And today everybody is somehow familiar with images, and it's not too hard to become someone that can generate images. So basically this ecosystem allowed us also, when we see a project that we know if we were to give money to, they would not be able to carry on their mission successfully on their own. So Kumara has allowed us to consider projects that are maybe strong on paper, but too difficult in the making process, but we can still grant them because we know we're going to invite them to Kumara and make sure they stay on the right track, or we put them on the right track by introducing them to the right people. So this is a little bit our approach since 2015.
Yeah. Having attended Kumara, I suppose what I really appreciated of that space was that there was it kind of disrupted this usual hierarchy that I'm used to, and I appreciated that, and what it gave us in terms of actually creativity. I wondered whether, Charlotte, you can speak a little bit to Field of Vision's pro-filmmaker response, and most recently with the pandemic, you also moved very fast to set up consultancy with filmmakers, and what you've learned from that process.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're very lucky in that, you know, when we founded it, it was largely people who had made films that founded Field of Vision. So we kind of came at it with a lens of trying to think of practices that filmmakers had experienced they didn't like, and how could we walk in and kind of challenge them, especially in the short film space. And we've always, I hope, you know, this is always the hope, is that we are a space that's very receptive to feedback and criticism from our filmmakers. And that actually kind of led us to funding features. We had only intended to fund shorts. And then over time, the filmmakers we work with, because we tend to have a more artistic bent, said, you know, the work that we're trying to make in the feature space isn't getting funded. You know, would you be open to supporting features? So we've tried to kind of evolve in a way that is very responsive to filmmakers and what they need, which has been amazing. I mean, it's a great thing. And then obviously when the pandemic hit, you know, we are very lucky in that, you know, we had, our organization had said, you know, you are guaranteed for your budget for the year. You know, we kind of came in at a place that had been, you know, communicated as somewhat stable, and we knew that other organizations weren't, and that we're really having to go inward and figure out, you know, logistics and their staffing. And so we kind of felt it was our duty to step in if we could. And one of the things we did was we instantly reviewed our budget and thought, okay, what can we be doing? And while we were doing that, the one thing we thought we could give was our time. You know, I'd been talking to filmmakers and they felt very disconnected. You know, the industry had kind of shut its doors while it was figuring stuff out, which is totally understandable. But we kind of were in a position where we just thought, well, let's give our time, first of all, just so that filmmakers at least talk to somebody. You know, and we didn't have any answers, but it was purely just to try and give that space. And we're still doing that. I mean, I think we've done over 300 meetings with filmmakers at this point. And it's great. I mean, it's as mutually beneficial more than anything. It's lovely to hear what filmmakers are going through. I mean, not in terms of what they're going through, but in terms of being able to communicate with filmmakers around the world every day feels really beneficial to us, because again, we can be employing that in what we're doing. It feels like it's direct feedback. And then we managed to kind of use some of our operating budget to create a relief fund. And again, for me, it was really, you know, I think because I'm obviously British living in the US, I'm constantly thinking about different countries. It's just nature of how I think. And I had noticed a lot of the other funds couldn't do international. They were largely either, say, UK based or US. And so we opened it worldwide. And, you know, reading through those entries, it's just, you know, I feel incredibly honored to have been allowed to understand what everyone's going through around the world and how the different countries are being affected. And that will, again, influence what we do in the future. So that feedback loop is really important to me, because I want filmmakers to feel like we do listen and we respond in, you know, based on what is important to them. So, yeah.
Thank you. So coming to Jess, it would be great to hear your thoughts about this reimagining. And of course, Doc Society recently announced a commitment to change with specific points. So it would be great to hear more about these commitments.
Yeah, I'd love to pick up and build on a number of the points that have been made already. Starting firstly with yours, Adam, about the power dynamics that often exist in these pitching spaces. And they're very valuable because they're spaces that bring together the players in the market. But we've always made it a matter of principle that our programs are always free for filmmakers, so that there isn't that dynamic of a filmmaker has paid to perhaps have a less than satisfactory series of meetings with decision makers who don't seem as present as they could be. And in fact, I've long advocated that filmmakers should be doing ratings of decision makers at those forums to be made public, because actually if there was a ranking of the most helpful and engaged decision makers in those meetings, I think it would soon sharpen people's minds to their responsibility of the time of the filmmaker that they're taking across the table. And then, yeah, I mean, it's a funny time because there's more resources for commissioned documentary right now than there has been for a really long time. But of course, what we believe in here is the independent space. And I agree, Ellen, that this is a time of great risk for that independent space. But also a time for us to critique, you know, as well as we move to save it and strengthen it, also a moment for us to critique it and change it. And, you know, I've always felt the independent space was a place of liberation, because it's a place where people were making their own work away from the market. And as Khalil is saying, you know, there's a low barrier to entry, even if that entry point is simply the beginning of the creation of images. But obviously, it's also a space that replicates existing inequalities, because to have the ability to enter that space and to spend the time and to even imagine yourself as an independent filmmaker often replicates, you know, and when we look at the profile of the most successful independent filmmakers, they often do have other sources of income or other advantages to kind of fall back on. And that's something which, of course, we've been well aware of in the field, and with partners on this call have been wanting to address these issues for a long time and haven't done a lot to address some of these issues in a long time. I think for us at Doc Society, we reflected that actually we'd spent probably much more of our energy over the last decade really working with Global South partners to address some of those inequalities. And so to think, how can we help organizations like Doc Society get started in other places so that they can actually move resources more directly, or also raise resources locally too, as well as attract international, so that actually they can grow their own ecosystems without always being reliant on coming to the decision makers in the global north. And we've, you know, that's been a really fruitful and wonderful process. And we've worked with partners in Kenya and India and Indonesia and indeed in Beirut. We were just talking about Beirut in the green room. But we realized that we've perhaps done less to think about how to help build organizations like that in the global north that might be able to champion different groups and to sort of, you know, make more of a plurality of organizations like our own. So that was sort of been a realization. And I wanted to reference Sonia and Natalie's article, which you began with, and say that, you know, Sonia is such a valuable voice in our field. Whenever she writes, you know, she comes to something and she illuminates it in the most extraordinary way. She's such a valued colleague. And I agree with everything in the article, but the only thing about the article, and again, it's like one article can't do all things, but I'd love to see a build on from that, because it felt a little bit like a lack of redemption there. It felt a little bit like we haven't seen films that have grappled with those dynamics and been successful, or if not completely successful, then shining the way of different documentary practice. Because, you know, there is some really interesting co-collaboration work going on, and, you know, there are things, I think, to be proud of how many independent filmmakers have thoughtfully gone about their work. And that builds on what Chiwe is saying, which is that actually we need criticism in this area, because if we can hold up, you know, even aspects of films which really show us the way forward and identify them and speak about them as a field, then it's much more likely that we progress as a field. And I think many filmmakers have been working actually in really fantastic ways for decades, but perhaps it hasn't become a kind of the field-wide conversation that it needed to. So I really second and really impressed by Ford's insight and his insight into funding that area. And that also makes me think about the Black Lives Matter moment, because it's that sense of, this is a moment to not be afraid of criticism and to lean into it and to lean into discomfort and critique, but always making sure that we don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, because we have to keep moving forward and we have to keep building and trying to do better, but they'll, you know, and owning the mistakes as we go. But yeah, but it's an exciting time. And so what we're doing at Doc Society is we're hiring a new head of film who'll be based out of the UK. We've shortlisted, so that's an announcement we're making shortly. And we're going to be digging into some of these issues with them. And the three things we're going to be looking at is the allocation of our resources and how we understand, you know, do we want to take more definitive decisions about how much resource moves to different communities in the global north of that work that we do. Also, what's the process by which we do that? And actually, are the processes that we're using got a lot of embedded barriers in them that we're not understanding? I know the Bertha Foundation, Adrian and I had a great conversation about, you know, is it better to work with filmmakers where they don't have to write written applications? And I thought that was really interesting, in a way of thinking about it. Actually, does that lower a barrier for entry, because it stops preferencing people who are really good at writing applications, and really gets us to just hear from filmmakers. And someone like Charlotte always meets with filmmakers all the time, so she's sort of doing that implicitly anyway. But do we need to move those kinds of models? And then the final thing was just even the model of funding itself, and begin to think about, actually, do we need to build on some of these early efforts by other organizations to fund the artist, not the project? And actually, is it by giving long-term artist support that we can actually really make the field inclusive? So that's sort of like, in a nutshell, where our head is at.
Lots of thoughts there. I really want to come back to the rating funders. No, it's an interesting way of thinking about dynamics. And I think, so questions of diversity and inclusion have been kind of forefront of discussions for a very long time. And I wanted to reference another document that's been very important for me these past weeks, which is This Work Isn't For Us by Gemma Desai. And I strongly recommend it to anyone watching as well. She asks in it why, despite 30 years of sustained professional development programs, recruitment drives, and mentoring programs resulting in a highly qualified, well-networked and credible set of individuals from a range of ethnic backgrounds, the industry is, in its static nature, is still focused on the individuals who are excluded rather than on those who do the excluding. And thinking about this, and you've touched on this a little in even your discussion with Adrian, I wanted to ask you about accessibility and about creating safe, welcoming, accessible spaces. It's not enough of a practice in our industry. And an example of this is that this panel doesn't have a BSL interpretation or closed captions. This is often reserved for spaces that are engaging directly with disability. The recording will later be available on YouTube, and that will have closed captions, but I wanted to acknowledge that because there are people who've been locked out from engaging this morning. So in thinking about that, how are you ensuring that you are not only not locking people out, but also centering filmmakers with care and thinking about things like accessibility, which you've brought up, in terms of your applications, in terms of your premises, in terms of who feels able to have a direct conversation with you, and how do you ensure that those who have felt actively locked out by the systemic structures feel actually safe to engage with those spaces? It's a question open to anyone who's willing to take it now, and I'll let you. Yeah, Charlotte?
We've actually been thinking about this a lot. I am very proudly the daughter of somebody with a disability, so I should have acted on this sooner, and I think we've got to own up to those things too. But we've been thinking about this. We just published a film about inaccessibility on transit systems in the US. But we haven't, we've always had an effort to caption on our films, but we haven't done audio description. And we've been trying to think about, what does it mean to be an online publisher for one? The different spaces, and actually what's been really kind of wonderful is seeing the filmmaker response to this. So when we've talked to filmmakers saying, hey, we want to move into this space, how filmmakers have just completely embraced this as an interesting, creative, new outlet. So one of the films we're going to publish soon has actually used the audio description. It's got a very notable person to do it. And people are actually as excited about the person doing this audio description as the film itself. And it's so exciting to see that is now a selling point of the film, and it's amazing. And I was talking to another filmmaker the other day who largely does kind of essayistic work that's voiceover driven. And she was saying she's as excited to do the kind of one narration versus the audio description because she sees them as two different writing exercises that she's really excited about. And I think, we were talking to, there's a great new organization called Filmmakers with Disabilities in Documentary. And they have a new website, and you should definitely check them out. And they are really looking at this of kind of, let's think about it in a positive way. And one thing we talk with them about that we are trying to look at in how we can support is the barrier to entry, like you were talking about, is often, especially on crews and on sets, often people see it as a kind of financial thing to make sets and spaces accessible that they can't justify. So we're trying to look into like, how can we help in that? I mean, we're figuring it out. I have no answers yet, but I think we have to look at these spaces. Because I think, film festivals are inaccessible. I mean, some theatres are, but say parties aren't. And that's a huge thing to opt out of. I think you're right in terms of applications. We don't invest in this enough. And I think, this, when we talk about kind of accessibility, it's across the board, right? So it's thinking everything being in English language is hugely inaccessible. And I think it really is on our responsibility to cut down those barriers as much as we possibly can, because we benefit from that. Incredibly amazing, talented people who are by default shut out. So I think we have to do better on this.
Thank you. Any other thoughts from the panel, or commitments, I suppose? Adrian?
I mean, just as Charlotte was speaking, it enrages me when I hear people say, "Oh, that'll take too much time," or "That's too much effort," just to build a ramp into into your event or something like that. It is infuriating, and it really speaks to what we're grappling with around privilege at this point in time. And again, when you spoke to this idea of duty of care, what is our responsibility, and what is our duty of care to check our privileges and be opening to transform our processes based on the needs that are identified by those who are disabled, who do not have the accessibility to these things. So really, just being in a humble place to keep our ears open to the needs that are expressed by different communities is so essential right now. And people are struggling with that. We all struggle with that. But we all have privileges, and we all have disadvantages. And yeah, it behooves us to really come at this in a humble and open way. And I just wanted to share that because it's just so important, and it just lights a fire in me, I suppose.
Well, it's good. I think let's keep that fire burning, because I think that's the only way that things can actually change. And maybe just to think again about this notion of feedback loop, because that's where things also do change, when you feel there's a groundswell of people asking for something. And also, I just don't want to forget this distinction between feedback from filmmakers who perhaps in a slightly more vulnerable position, having to speak to funders who they also rely on to make their work, and thinking about how you can safely request certain things and ask for certain things. So thinking about this, I think, you know, the word accountability has been coming up a lot. And I just wondered what that means within your structures, and whether you can speak about things like assessment structures, the spaces that you create for people to feed into the work you're doing, whether you have grievance procedure, like structures in place so that people can safely also complain. I mean, it's not, you know, these aren't always easy things to talk about, but I think they do create kind of robust and safe, thoughtful spaces. Oh, Chi-Wei first and then Jess.
Yeah. Sure, maybe I'll just say a few things. One thing, you know, we support a lot of organizations as well. And I think that one thing that's been very clear has been adequate funding to have, say, proper HR function is something that organizations often do not put resource into. It's usually the funding is project driven. There's a real sort of starving of the administration of organizations. And oftentimes that is the piece that really, that allows, you know, a lot of these dynamics to grow, you know. And so, you know, from a funder's perspective, thinking about how to loosen the dollars, make sure that organizations have the right kind of resources so that they can build strong internal operations that allow facilitation and movement through complex dynamics. And as organizations that historically have not been diverse become more diverse, naturally they will encounter a plurality of voices and different types of opinions and conflicts, right? So those need to be managed. And so I think that's an important thing. I also think a lot, just going back to an earlier point too, this notion of capitalization. And you know, one way of being, you know, more inclusive and equitable is not holding folks' budgets against them. You know, I think we have all seen project budgets which are way under budget, or organizations that are historically undercapitalized that have very low operating budgets. And I think that oftentimes grants are pegged to this when they really should not be. Grants should be pegged to the work or the ambition of the work, right? And so I think that's incumbent upon funders to talk through both organizations and filmmakers their budgets, and to support them at the ways that are at levels that make sense for that project, even if it means that you need to raise your budget, and we will support you at that increased level.
So Jess, did you have something to say? And then Charlotte?
Yeah, I just think it's something interesting happening in the doc space, particularly in the US over the last few years, and that's been really a building of a kind of richer civil society of documentary, with a lot of organizations starting and popping up, representing and speaking for different groups within the documentary community. And I think that's really powerful and really important. And when we started Doc Society 15 years ago, we were sort of like, we felt we were that. We were like, actually, no one cares about independent filmmakers, no one's championing them. And so we kind of popped up. But obviously, you need a plurality of voices and a plurality of organizations. And I know, you know, the Ford Foundation have funded many of those groups. And in fact, we've been talking to Adrian and a bit to Charlotte too about, you know, the need to spark more of these groups here in the UK. I don't know how many people who are on this call are UK. Obviously, Sheffield is a global film festival, and the voices on this call are global. But I imagine that there's still maybe a predominance of UK filmmakers here. And actually, the UK has been really slow to sort of emulate and see what's happening in the US. And I think that's incredibly, incredibly important. So I've been talking to Adrian and already have moved some resources together to help some groups to kind of like strengthen and get started. And also been talking to the BFI about the same thing. We started actually talking to the BFI about this last year and saying, could we move some funding to sort of help fund the ecosystem to kind of let more of these groups emerge? Because as you say, Ellen, it shouldn't be on the shoulders of an individual filmmaker, and it never should have been. It was why we started Doc Society, because like an independent filmmaker can't go and, you know, negotiate with Channel 4 or explain to, you know, the ICA why there should be more. Or we know it's like there has to, you know, it's really difficult making films, and it requires a certain personality and commitment, and that's what filmmakers are doing. And actually, they need to come together and figure out who in their number have that organizing gene and to raise their voices. And we need to be moving the funding to them And it's often not a lot of funding, but obviously people's time has to be compensated so that they're actually not trying to now do 2 jobs. And I think that will massively help, because it means that what we would love in the UK as Doc Society is to have multiple groups, you know, to be in discourse with and to have these accountability conversations with. Much as Chiwe was saying about the role of you know, of criticism, you know, artistic criticism and the importance of that in the field. Also, you know, we need to be getting this kind of, you know, being this kind of critique dialogue, being told where we're getting it right and where we must do better by a multiplicity of groups.
I mean, Charlotte, did you have something to say? And then I maybe have a couple of responses.
Yeah, I was just going to quickly add, it's based on what she was just said as well. I think what's on my mind a lot, I mean, I suppose I work in the US field, is this kind of capitalization, is that it's a lot of commercial corporate money is now coming into the space. And I think when I think about the UK, I hope filmmakers can advocate for themselves more, because I think we are stuck in a broadcast-centric field. Whereas in the US, it's not quite the same, except that it's heading into the very streamer-dominated field. And I worry about, you know, when we're looking at budgets and everything that Chiwe was saying, is filmmakers so undervalue themselves. And I think part of the reason that happens is because a lot of the people who are buying films undervalue the films for them. And so filmmakers believe they have to match that. And I think, you know, having worked in this field for so long, you hear over and over again from people, oh, there isn't the same audience for documentaries as there is for other. It's just not true. It's just absolute nonsense. It's just, we don't get that kind of viewing data that we should have. And you're seeing a very thriving market on all of these platforms for documentary that, you know, starting to buy them for bigger money. They know there's an audience there. They're just not explaining it to us to keep us undervalued. And I think it's very important that filmmakers can feel more empowered in those conversations, whether it's with a broadcast, whether it's with a streamer. It's very hard because the dynamic has almost been set as if they shouldn't be. But the films do well. You know, they may lead us to believe they don't, but they do, especially when people know about them. Like, that's the barrier, right? That's what we're all asking for, is like, please tell people about our film so they'll watch it. The moment you do that, people do watch it. So I hope that, you know, in the future, we see filmmakers being able to value themselves more, being able to make films for what they actually cost to make, that funders will match them on that, and that then the people who present the films to the world give them proper value positioning and a transparent back with the filmmakers about how well they did. And, you know, the fact that that is a more equitable conversation, I think.
Yeah, I think this is moving into very rich grounds. Just before I come to you, Khalil, I just wanted to also, I mean, first of all, this adequate funding for HR is a really interesting point to bring up, because that makes sense in the space of organizations. In the space of a film, for example, I think you'll often find that the producer is the person who is managing a team, as well as doing this kind of combination of creative, strategic. And I, as a producer, obviously, but, you know, amongst my peers, we're very conscious of the fact that our role is the one that's the most often kind of sacrificed in terms of closing budgets and having to defer fees, having to kind of take positions in recruitment and seeing what's given to us lessen, whereas our responsibilities are only increasing. And I think that's something that's really damaging. First of all, who can be in this space and who can safely be in this space? And as we, you know, if you're engaging with complex narratives, if you're talking about personal stories, if you're engaging with vulnerability, then the producer is also the person who's enacting the biggest duty of care. And that might mean carrying a lot, and maybe a lot more than you're kind of equipped or trained or able to actually carry. So, I mean, I do also want to put that, you know, the onus of that shouldn't just be on us. And I wonder, first of all, around the kind of economic sustainability and how it's not just about filmmakers valuing themselves, but filmmakers being valued in, you know, their budgets, for example. And I wonder, as funders, you know, you see budgets day in, day out. You see what different people are paid. We probably don't speak enough about these things with each other, or clearly enough. But do you think it is part of your responsibility to also ensure that everyone is paid adequately when you see a budget and you see that people have underestimated? You know, a first-time filmmaker might not realize that they're in it for 7 years to come, and that actually when they've decided to pay themselves, like, you know, what feels like a reasonable salary, that's a reasonable salary for maybe 1 year. It's not a reasonable salary for 7 years. So, I mean, I'd love to know how you feel about the role you can play in making the work of making films more sustainable and, by extension, more open to all. And perhaps, Khalil, what you were going to say also speaks to this. And I know Doha has a very particular engagement with building the ecosystem.
Yeah. For us, I guess it's completely different, because for development and production, it is mostly for the Arab world. And as I said earlier, most, if not all, of Arab documentary filmmakers are telling a story because they feel the need and the urge to say it. So it is beyond the monetary value of generating the images, of paying themselves. And I think in the documentary world, I'm a filmmaker myself, there is absolutely no way, unless you have a film or a subject ordered by a TV station that will finance the film. Otherwise, I think you are going to be suffering, and you're going to find yourself with no money, and you're going to stop shooting. And this is what we grant. Actually, 90% of the documentaries we grant, we know we're not going to see them for 6, 7, 8 years. And our job is through Kumra and the labs that we organize throughout the year. As soon as there is a lab, I share a list of granted documentary films that I know would benefit from those labs. And then we try to bring them through that to give them, first of all, is I think the first message that we send by giving a grant, and a grant for us is $30,000, $35,000, $40,000 for production, which is a lot, but it is also nothing. It's absolutely nothing in the West. It could be nothing in the Arab world as well, if you have to start taking into account salaries, etc., etc. I think within that realm, you would not be able to do a documentary. So it is our way, by giving the money, is to say, we trust you and we trust your idea. Here is our little contribution, not to give up. Okay. And then our job is to follow with them and help them with the little means that we have. I can take maybe a producer that is keen on helping a documentary filmmaker, and I will present them and just do little actions like this that in the end do allow the project to move forward. We receive very little documentaries from North America and from Europe. Even when we were open at production level. Why? Because in Europe, the tradition nowadays is, unless you have the full budget, you are not supposed to go into production with fiction and with documentary. In the Arab world and with these independent filmmakers, is whatever I can get money on, I will go and shoot. When I have no more money, I'll go and eat at my brother's or stay with my parents until I get some more money to start the machine again, you know. So I think it's important also to allow these filmmakers to generate images and not think beyond. Yes, we want them to be paid, but if we start taking that into account, then we're not going to fund them. Those films will not be made. And I think it is important nowadays to generate, especially from the Arab world, as many images as possible, because our politicians will not support such subjects and they will never be generated. So at least for the past 30 years, thanks to the advent of analog or digital technology, that we are seeing so many films being generated, maybe in more time than it would in the West, but they are generated. And Al Jazeera has a program for creative documentary, Deuxième in Morocco. So it's starting, you know.
I wondered, I mean, there is another way, I think, in which you support an ecosystem within the Arab region in particular, which I think is quite interesting in this discussion, which is the assessment process, which is like a rotating jury of essentially people at all levels of the filmmaking industry who are paid to be involved in a very robust conversation. And I think that's quite an invisible but quite a significant way in which you are paying people to be critically engaged in the industry and their time is recognized. But equally, you're also creating these mini champions for the films that they are then selecting, or even if they're not selected, you know. And I think that's something I've really observed in, you know, my different hats working in the region. And it speaks to something we haven't had time to address, which is around assessment processes. And I wondered how, I think that's an interesting model.
Yeah, I mean, basically, you know, we receive around 400 projects per session, and we have 2 sessions per year. This session with the COVID, we received more than 500. I guess people were home writing. And we do have to rely on very established people from the industry to give us feedback and to assess all these projects. So the idea first is to have 3 evaluators assess each project. These evaluations are available upon request to the project holders, whether they get supported or not. And once we've received all these evaluations, we go from 400 to some 70 projects that are pre-selected and that are given to an international jury. And these jury members are always composed of Westerners and Arabs. I think there needs to be a balance. We have 3 external jury members and 2 internal. We have women as well. And the idea is to work with festival programmers, with sales agents, with critics, with professors at the university. But I think for me, beyond what I just said, is working with people that are extremely open-minded, that are well-traveled, that know about the other, they respect the other, that they have an interest into the other. I think these are the values that are necessary before knowing how to evaluate a project, no matter the geography. So this is the way we do it. And then they're given these 70 projects, they read them, and then we have them come to Doha, and we spend 5 days in a hotel room, in a conference room, from 8 to 5, discussing every single project, maybe going from 70 to some 35, and then going down. And what I do with my evaluators, I ask them not to look at the financial information. We ask them just to concentrate on the artistic part of the project. And I think the financial and the producers behind the project and the financial plan, that comes later once they're shortlisted. And even with that, we know that we're going to be supporting some projects that will take a long time, that we may be taking risks into supporting because they don't have the full funding. But I think giving the money is also encouraging other funds. Oh, Doha has supported even ourselves. If we see the Ford Foundation or the Cinéma du Monde or somebody else that is established, you do look at the project in a different way. It doesn't mean we will support it, but you look at it and consider it further. So, voilà.
There's a question from the Q&A around actually this, about the assessment process, and asking, as applications take a significant amount of time, not having any responses on your application can be soul destroying and not very helpful in progressing a project. And is that something that funders will consider? So as we're discussing that space, and perhaps not something for a direct answer unless anyone has one, but the feedback loop and thinking about it in the other direction as well could be really valuable. Sorry, I'm quite conscious of time. Did you have something to say, Chi-Wei?
Yeah, I just want to go back to an earlier piece about this notion of sustainability. And I think that a couple of dynamics that are really complex in system, which I don't have the answer for, are around professionalization and commercialization, right? And I think these naturally are very exclusive forces that value certain voices because they're market driven, and they naturally, champion the voices that are already, recognizable. And folks who are marginalized society already shut out with them. But I think this notion of professionalization is really complex because, as Khalil was talking about, documentaries produced in a range of different formal and informal ways, right? And there's a real push within this field to professionalize, right? All these things around being a pro and professional, I think that is really misleading because it sets the expectations that you can actually be a properly resourced and paid professional in this, when that actually is not the case. It's like when all these academic systems are producing all these PhDs to go to the market, but it's like no one's going to hire them. But to create all these projects where the desire to be paid properly is the expectation, I think is really complex, right? And that goes hand in hand with the commercialization which is also that the people who have the proper budgets are a select few as well. And so I don't have the answer for this right now, but I think the push toward professionalization, I think, is really complicated, needs to be treated with very carefully. I think there's other modes of how you invest in artists about their careers and their longevities, and thinking about how do you support someone's practice and deepen it over time as opposed to support their project. You know, how do you support their inquiry and their analysis and their practice? And I think that's a thing that invests them over the long term, as opposed to, you know, supporting you as a professional in a field that is not professionalized at all.
Charlotte, did you have something to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything you said there, I think, is so important. And I think there is no one size fits all, right? I mean, when we think about funding, there are certain projects who do not want to take certain kinds of funding because they want to protect their creative process. And I think we have to have this space for different practices, for different processes, different funding and what it means. Because, you know, for example, if we commercialize everything, that's going to be a whole different type of films and it's going to block a lot of people out. And I think also the space we have to figure out as a field is the development process, because it's just so underfunded and so much of the work comes in that. So much of the critical thinking and the exploring, pushing the art form forward comes through that. And there's no space for people financially to be able to support that kind of work. And then I just wanted to speak to the feedback question. I'm really stuck on this question, I have to say, because I would say, like, the field of vision of anything kind of that doesn't come through from our submissions, I would say 90% of the time it's just not kind of the film we make. So it's nothing on the quality of the project or what they're making by any means. We're quite narrow, I guess, in some ways. We just have a certain remit of what we make. But I really struggle, and I always struggle with this as a festival programmer as well, of feeling, in some ways, who am I to say what you shouldn't do? You know, I would always kind of say to people, if they really, at Hot Docs, we would say, you know, if they really wanted feedback on their film, if it was still in active process, if they were still working on it, we would give notes. But if it was done, it's not for us to say what is right and wrong about it. That is the film they wanted to make. But I think it's a really good question about submissions and feedback. I mean, I feel like I would give feedback on a proposal if there was something maybe in structurally, but I wouldn't want to do it on the creative. That doesn't feel right. You know, everything kind of needs to find its home in its own way. I don't know. I'm stuck on this. I don't know what the right answer is, if I'm honest.
I think perhaps some of it also speaks to the very hierarchies of how filmmakers feel able to speak to the spaces that might enable them to make their work. And I think just coming back to this notion of accountability and reflecting on the fact that, you know, obviously you represent very different spaces. Some of you as funders or foundations also support, say, festivals or events as well as films. And I think in thinking about accountability, perhaps there is a piece of work that I'm really intrigued in around budget lines for different people, and how, you know, I just find it really, this is an under-discussed space. And I think if we're really going to talk about sustainability, this is where it starts. And to think about, as funders with insights across the board, like, you are in the strongest position to enact kind of change and to ensure that values and kind of are shifted, or to also recognize perhaps that there are historical practices that were perhaps skewed in one way or another, and to rectify them. I'm quite conscious of time. I feel like we haven't brought up the C word, which is unusual in a panel these days, but I did want to address COVID just again around this question of care. And first of all, for those watching and anyone who is thinking of filming, there's an amazing resource, COVID-19 risk assessment, that was put together by Field of Vision, Doc Society, Sundance, and others, which is available on all of their websites. And I believe in the link has been posted in the chat box. And so I wanted to ask around, outside of the logistics, again, coming back to the economics of COVID and thinking, well, first of all, if you haven't addressed that already, how has the pandemic affected your organization, the budgets that you are working with, the priorities that you have? And in many spaces, we're talking about a 20% hike in budgets to ensure safety, and whether that's something that you are actively talking to your grantees about, or are willing to obviously see within their budgets and prepared to also fund. Going back to what Chiwe was saying around kind of funding the things that we actually want to see. And then also with that in mind, I've been really struck by this conversation around COVID and how it's forcing everyone to think about responsibility in relation to transmission and illness. It's responsibility around care, well-being, and I would really love to see that extended into the space of filmmaking for good, and to think about how we don't talk about mental health and well-being in the space of documentary enough. We don't have budget lines for mental health provision, for consultancy, or supports in areas of risk, for example. And I think, you know, the fact that we can all suddenly, I mean, theoretically talk about hiking our budgets 20% to cover this risk, I wonder how you feel about just taking that a step further and thinking about the future that we want to bring into this space as well.
I can jump into all those kind of reasonably quickly. So along, as you said, we got involved in creating those resources along with Field of Vision and Sundance and a whole bunch of others. And that's because as a group of organisations, we've been very concerned about safety and security in the field for a long time. So COVID actually is just the latest aspect for us to kind of consider, and Safe and Secure is the wider project, which really helps independent filmmakers have the resources and the models to think through what their risk profile is for all kinds of films that they're making. So we've long advocated as organisations that safety resources need to be in budgets, they need to be thought about early on, and they need to be in budgets, and that funders who are funding films must fund safety, otherwise they are irresponsible funders. So in a way, nothing new there, it's just this is the latest iteration of it, and as you say, it has real expenses in budgets. I would say our budgets have remained the same. We haven't had to cut any of our intentions or funding intentions. The BFI fund, all those funds stayed the same. I would say the danger is not the funding this year or possibly even next year. It's actually what the COVID-induced recession is going to do to all the funding sources that feed into the independent world over the kind of slightly longer sort of 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 years. And that is, is unknown. We are looking at our own funding sources and figuring that some will lessen and fall away as funders quite rightly decide they want to fund other priorities and more frontline priorities. And we're also looking at who we might bring into the field to replace that, who might more understand the importance of funding arts and culture and documentary at this time, but it is pretty unknown, I'd say. And in terms of shifting our priorities, I'd say it's actually been Black Lives Matter much more than COVID, which has shifted our priorities about funding and our thoughts, and we covered a little bit of that earlier. I mean, I think we were just trying to get our head around what COVID meant in terms of funding priorities, and then actually, BLM brought a much bigger conversation. But we have also got involved in a hardship, because we're well known for working in impact as well as working just in filmmaking, and certainly we're seeing a lot of hardship already. We have a hardship fund, which we administer with a group of other people, including Sonia Childress, which is from the Perspective Fund, which has gone out to impact producers globally. And that hardship fund, the applications into that hardship fund, much as Charlotte was saying earlier, when you get out there and you speak to vast masses of people, you get that kind of data in from the field. I mean, the picture being painted of what is going to happen to the independent documentary field outside the global north, is definitely chastening. So if COVID has affected our priorities at all, it's about thinking, how do we help to shore up those places that fall outside government schemes and government welfare nets?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just wondering, just responding to what you were saying about, you have always had these priorities, but I suppose it's one thing to put together a budget that recognizes certain things, and it's another thing to raise that budget. And these are the things that will fall to the wayside along with the producer's fee. And I just, for me, this is also a space to really say, if we are all in this together as an ecosystem, it is also up to funders to really ensure that those lines stay there, and to think about how can we be supported, how can we work together to raise those budgets, how can we work together to actually ensure that that duty of care is shared.
Can I come back quickly on?
Yeah, of course.
I think that's also about, producers too, because, we know sometimes that, when you've got enough money to not cover everything, where do you put it? So it's about creating a culture of safety funders and producers that says, actually, this money is non-negotiable, because before we do anything, we must be safe. But I agree. I mean, I agree. It's a heartbreaking choice for a producer who's like, oh, we could get another month in the edit and we could finish the materials, might get funded, or we could pay for the safety resources, and that's a heartbreaking situation to be in. And to the point about sustainability, I think this is why we're also interested in this idea of, you know, funding artists rather than funding teams necessarily rather than funding projects, because then you don't put people in a situation where they are being asked to choose or sacrifice themselves. Does that make sense? If we sort of say, actually, if we can move to a model that kind of goes, okay, we're paying for this team for 2 years and let's all work together to raise other money, but actually sort of take it off the table that you cannot pay yourself and put all of that money, do you know what I mean, kind of into the shoe.
Yeah, but I think that's a really interesting way of thinking, and at the same time, it becomes so much more important to ensure that you are enabling access to a much wider group of people, and to think about who feels able or entitled to actually go for that support.
Well, I think this model I think this model would be much more equitable, because actually what it does is it opens it up for people who are like, actually, I can't spend 2 years living in a really precarious existence trying to raise money and not really knowing what's going on, because, you know, my background, my situation doesn't allow that precarity. So I think, yeah. Sorry,
I'm going to we've got only a couple more minutes, and there are a few more things that I wanted to address. We haven't talked very much about audience, and this is something that does come up a lot when pitching or funding at the moment, and first of all, thinking about the fact that there are, as Charlotte was saying, huge willing to pay audiences for documentary out there, and engaging those audiences is perhaps one of the best ways to ensure a multiplicity of funding sources. So what do you think you could be doing, or what are you doing to enable these connections and to grow audiences? And just building on that, how do you think impact, question from the Q&A from Cynthia, actually, the Sheffield DocFest director, considering that many times the potential for circulation of films is almost exclusively on the project and not on the need to invent better ways to bring them to audiences, ways to better bring them to audiences. A kind of two-part question. Open to anyone. Charlotte, go ahead.
This is, I mean, for me, this is the big question. And I feel like it's the one thing that always gets put as like, but we can't, or we can't afford it. And I feel it feels weird to almost talk about this even now, because obviously we're dealing with filmmakers needing to like survive. So the idea of talking about marketing and stuff, but it is the key. It is the key to our field. When you consider, you know, when you talk to people who engage with film in any way, a lot of the time they just haven't heard of these films. And I kind of always think, even, you know, when I worked at BBC Storyville, we were only, I mean, this is way back, so I'm sure it's not the same now, but, you know, of the slate we would have for the year, we were only kind of given the budget to maybe promote 2 of them in trailers. And that's tough, because, you know, when people do actually know about them, they absolutely watch the films. And I think it is incredibly hard that it's put on the film teams to not only, you know, make incredible work, but to promote it, to do all the work people want them to do around it. And I wish that, you know, in a magical world, there would be somebody who's like, I'm going to pay for the promotion and marketing of documentaries, and really do it well. And I hope we evolve into that. I mean, I hope it's, you know, I don't imagine this happening too soon, but, you know, you see it with, even when you think about like a Netflix, it matters if you're original versus not original because of the promotion. Like that, it's the placement, it's the, you know, we need more of that for documentaries, because audiences are there. They really are. And I think in a way that with fiction films, it is not on the director or that team to promote them in the same way it is for documentaries.
Yeah, I mean, let's try and imagine that magical space, because you never know. There might be a kind of an agency partnered with a philanthropist, partnered with the call from all of these spaces to enable that. Adrian, did you have something to add?
Yes, just quickly, that at Bertha we fund a lot of impact campaigns, and what my feeling was in the world pre-COVID, that a lot of audiences were looking for more experiential crossover. They were actually moving away from just sitting in one space viewing things and having more sort of transmedia experiences. And in the world post-COVID, that's something that I'm very interested in terms of distribution and audience. Coming back to Cynthia's question of how do we reimagine the way in which people engage with these different media, particularly given that they're looking for something authentic. I think this idea of authenticity keeps coming up, especially in this world of like post-truth, where people are looking for answers and truth. And in the field of documentary that is meant to bring that to them, I feel that impact campaigns and resources have to be wrapped up in that, teachable tools and links that connect the ecosystem. So it's not just one film about something, but it's actually grounded in a movement that will allow that film to live far beyond its regular distribution life cycle, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Chi-Wei, do you have some?
Just to add a couple of points. I think that one element of this that we've been thinking about is how to protect engagement rights and to make sure that those are held and maintained by filmmakers, despite, you know, when a lot of these distributors want to take up everything. So that's, I think, a very much an ongoing conversation. And I think this notion of how films get out really comes to how you define who the audience is. And the more that you broaden who the audience is, the more the different channels of ways in which films can get to people, right? And I think a structural problem there is that, you know, the films which are often thought to have the most limited audiences are those made by people of color, people who are disabled, folks who are already marginalized by society. And part of that is that the folks who are doing sales, distribution, marketing are largely not coming from those communities. We don't have the infrastructure and the know-how for the people to really understand how to see those audiences and how to bring folks to those audiences in the ways that those audiences want to engage. So I think that there's a whole sort of like set of actors that needs to be diversified in a serious way that will start to unlock some of these questions, because we have a very dominant way of thinking of how we get things to people, which is defined by a very small set of individuals and ways of thinking of distribution.
Thank you, that's very valuable points. We have no more time, so I just wanted to make note of a couple of things that have come in so that they've been said. One was thinking about decentralized ways of working that COVID is forcing us to engage with, and thinking about the role that funders, foundations can play in connecting people up. So for example, not being able to film in the US at the moment, but being connected up to filmmakers there that might be able to play that role for you. Another question was around looking to the future as financiers, and a question around whether support for research or enabling producers to engage with alternative economic models or innovation in investing, so circular economies, donut economies, participative budgeting. And finally, there was also a note, one filmmaker stating that they'd just gotten into IFP, a space in New York, which they usually wouldn't have been able to afford to travel to. And so that there are ways in which this moment and everything moving online is enabling. And that's something that hopefully we can also think about in our imagined future and think about what it's enabled us to do. It's been a really rich conversation. I really wanted to thank you all for taking part in it. And just before we close, also to thank the DocFest team, so Cynthia, Nigel, Manon and Ellie, to everyone who's contributed questions over the past few weeks. Also to all of the organizations who've kind of shared the information about this panel and shared questions. I wanted to also really shout out an organization that to me is really leading the way in terms of strong community, which is the Brown Girls Doc Mafia. And they have an ongoing, well, currently going GoFundMe fundraiser that I urge you to contribute to. And the link is in the chat as well. All the resources that we've mentioned, like the Sonia Childress's articles for Medium and IDA, definitely check them out. And Gemma decides this work isn't for us. The COVID risk assessment if you're thinking about filming. And that is it. Thank you so much, Adrian, Chi-Wei, Charlotte, Jess, and Khalil. It's been really wonderful to talk to you. And let's hopefully imagine a brighter future for when we can see each other in person soon. All right, take care, everyone. Bye.